Okay, we are off. Welcome back to the Woven Energy podcast with me, Joseph Sikora, and Damon Smith, here again to talk about shamanism from the ground up. And today we're just going to have a bit of a chat, really, Damon. I think we've got a few things coming up on the podcast, so should we just have a quick chat about what we've got planned? Because we've been having a few chats between episodes and thinking about the beginning of stage 3, haven't we?
Yeah, so I think we'll do an official, if you want to call it official, we'll do a full lead-in episode on that. I mean, we've said we're working on this thing, The Grove, which has video and all sorts of other things. And I guess this is a sort of point where we'll be doing a handover to The Grove. So I think we'll talk through, obviously we're going to talk through Spirit Dance and maybe stage 3 more broadly on the podcast itself. But yeah, there's a bit of a fork in terms of which direction we want to head in at the moment. We've got a bunch of things we said we were going to cover.
Yes.
For instance, there's the lead into the hexagrams, the 64 hexagrams. There's a lead into Spirit Dance. There's a lead into stage 3 in general and what that's about.
Well, I think my issue mainly is that we haven't done, we've been quite sporadic with these episodes over a while, and when we lead into stage 3, it's all of a sudden it's like, where the hell do you start? Because stage 1 is quite simple, in quotation marks.
Yeah.
Stage 2 is a bit less, it's more complex, but it's still it's very definitive, isn't it? It's quite like we know what we're doing with stage 2, and then we get to stage 3, and it's just like it's just an onslaught of complexity, and it's like, well, how do you get a very clear idea of what stage 3 is, or should I say, how can we portray that in the best way possible on a podcast?
I can give you a sort of analogy for that. If you remember, we said that starting shamanism's, if you think getting into shamanism, like getting inside a ball, and we sort of said stage 1 and maybe stage 1's the welcome mat. Stage 2 is the door into the ball, which is, to use your physical body, that part of nature which is closest to you, as a tool to help you start to understand your relationship with nature. And we introduced this concept, this Japanese concept, or I say Japanese concept, shamanistic concept, kashimono, karimono, thing like the thing borrowed. And that's your door in. Now, I'm going to extend that analogy further. You imagine that door's a house, and you then get through the door, and you're into the next stage of shamanism 3, and you're in this enormous hallway with hundreds of doors leading off to various...
Yeah, and which door do you go down?
Weird, wonderful places. But the good news is, to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter which door you pick. It doesn't really matter which door you go through. The thing with shamanistic technique is it reflects the universe, and the universe is a big and complicated and extensive place. And shamanistic technique very much reflects that. So there is an enormous diversity. I guess, my personal preference for the Spirit Dance is that, unlike a lot of stage 3 technique, it is in itself a huge area. It's a big portion of stage 3 technique. It's not all of it, but it's a huge portion of it. And it also links into all those other techniques. We talked about Booking Hengreg, the shaman's link to nature through himself drum. I'm using himself drum as one word. Yeah. That link into nature that way, that unity extends into Spirit Dance, in that Booking Hengreg, if you do Spirit Dance with a drum, is fully part of that Spirit Dance experience. Obviously, the Spirit Dance experience is broader and bigger than that, but it's you could say that one way of looking at that is when you use a drum in Spirit Dance, or you could be doing Booking Hengreg that just happens to have some Spirit Dance technique in it, rather than Spirit Dance that just happens to have some Booking Hengreg technique in it. So I've always liked Spirit Dance because it seems to me to be a link to all the other kind of stage 3 techniques.
And it's a very physical thing, isn't it? Spirit Dance as well. It's a very...
Absolutely. I mean, get ready for it, because, from here on out, shamanism is very much a physical thing. It's even when it doesn't appear to be, It's very much a physical thing, and that's not just in terms of spirit dance, but you're right in that it gets you. It's another aspect that helps bring you up off that baseline, bring you up off the baseline ratiocination that we're all so good at. Just suck you away from that.
This is why going to the gym and even just lifting weights just gets you out of that brain fog. To be honest. I mean, it's much more deeper than that. I'm not reducing it down, but it's just one of the aspects,
Absolutely.
Besides the science behind all that, it's one of the reasons.
Yeah.
Is it we're getting off that logical, rational thinking and...
Well, it's not a matter of getting off it. I mean, you still need it. It's just that it's the bias, isn't it? It's the bias for it that you're trying to balance out. And it seems like we're trying to, I often say to people, get off the baseline. I don't really mean that literally. What I mean is stop being so biased to the baseline. Human beings in this day and age, in our society certainly, are so biased for the baseline that if they do nothing at all, what they see as nothing at all, actually, they're doing an awful lot of baseline activity because we're so habituated.
I struggle with it so much, and I suspect quite a few people will, because if I'm in the middle of a thinking task, which I tend to be doing a lot of these days, I just can't form words. Words don't come out of my mouth properly, and I can't form sentences. I'm like, you what? And you just end up in this really foggy state. And I do know, and this is a tip for anybody like who does struggle with that, is you do anything physical, you exert yourself, and all of a sudden you feel much better, and that fog does lift, even though it's temporary, but it does provide some respite to that, should I say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, here's a question for you, Dermot. You say we're talking about shamanic techniques. Where do you think the shamanic technique comes into play, where a shaman will have to go and find an object? Somebody hides an object and the shaman goes and finds it. Where would that sit? You can probably guess where I'm going with this.
Yeah. So I know what you're talking about. I mean, we talked about initiation ceremonies, and I gave my opinion on them as well. So that sits very much in the sort of level 5 type of area. So we're not there yet. So if you remember what we said, we said that again, switching on the Mongol terms, it doesn't mean that you can only understand this with Mongol terms, but we said Bhaktam Sesab, we can Chalisti training, and then we get the Amska, the breath training, which, as we now know, if you've been listening to the recent episodes, is way more, it has a bigger meaning than breath. It's more about accessing nature through your own body. And then we have the Bolbichig, which is what we're just coming on to, level 3. You can use Bolbichig and other technique to create Guru, which is the weave after which woven energy is named. You could think of that as level 4, and then you slip onto the vessel. That can happen in a lot of different ways, but that's Modach. So that's kind of level 5. And in slipping onto the vessel, when you come onto a Modach training, what you find is you become aware of a lot of things, just a lot of things that it's difficult. Don't get me wrong. I'm just, you just slip onto the vessel. Yeah, it's and those words that I'm using are really, 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 really poor, but I don't have any others, Do you follow what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So let's stick with Modach.
I do remember you saying at one point that when we do slip on, because I think it was a few years ago now when we were together doing this, but you said that you will know when you create that vessel and you slip in onto it. It's not like it's an abstract thing. It'll be very clear when it happens.
Yeah. And I can give you a friend of ours was doing some shamanic practice. It's a bit of a funny story. And he'd written down somebody's phone number, and the bit of paper he'd written on it, half the number had got washed away in the rain. Oh. So he used shamanic technique at that kind of level, at the Modoc level, to reconstruct the phone number successfully. There's an incredibly trivial application. Incredibly trivial application of shamanic technique. But I really like that. I thought it was so funny, you know.
Well, the reason I bring up that and finding stuff is obviously like the discerning listeners amongst those out there might notice that your voice sounds a bit different today, and that is because your mic has gone walkabouts and it's gone missing.
Absolutely.
So maybe you can apply a little bit of shamanic technique, Damon, and find that mic for the next time we record.
There are certain members of my household who may be of a fairly junior age who are renowned for their ability to make magic like that happen.
Well, we'll have to see how Apple fares in the old microphone. We'll see.
Sure.
So we were talking through the week, and we were discussing the next few episodes. But something that came up, which I think might be interesting to discuss, was shamanism and atheism. And, it's a funny one, this, isn't it? Because I get the feeling that if you talk to an atheist, you'd have so much in common with an atheist.
Sure.
But an atheist would have absolutely zero in common what they perceive as a shaman.
Yeah.
So I thought this might be an interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I would probably agree with them on everything, and yet they would have the problem with me being, quote unquote, into shamanism. Yeah.
Well, it's
because of what they think shamanism is.
Yeah. Well, it's like I don't want to categorize all atheists, because atheist is a categorizing term, but they'll see shamanism as a guy or a lass dressed up in animal skins and just preaching what he's gaining knowledge outside normal reality, and he's dancing around, prancing around, and that's all they see.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to it. You came up with a phrase. You came up with a phrase when we were talking, what was it now? A shaman would find so much in common with you, and you would find so much in common with the shaman.
Yeah, I can't remember, mate. I have no idea what you're talking about. But that's not unusual, the way my brain is. Yeah. So I think that, in terms of this whole, we've spent a lot, I guess, and here's a warning I would put on this episode for people listening. If you haven't listened to our episodes on the miasma, this is going to make no sense at all. Yeah. So I believe that was it. Episode 4 was our first kind of. Are we obsessed with the baseline? Was that episode?
Yes, that was episode 4. Was Are We Obsessed with the Baseline? And then the major miasma episodes were 13, 14, and 15. No, yeah, 14, 15, and 16, or 13, 14, and 15. I can't quite remember.
So basically, if you haven't listened to those episodes, my recommendation is go back and listen to them before you listen to us having this discussion. I think that another thing to say about this discussion is it's in some ways it's a matter of supreme indifference to me. But on the other hand, it is true that both myself and Joe were atheists when we came to shamanism. We didn't, quote unquote, believe in God. And I think in terms of what most people mean by God, we're still atheists, right? I don't know what you feel, Joe, but I would say I'm still an atheist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like if I still talk, I ran around in the atheist circles, and the more I got into shamanism, the less I was inclined to categorize myself, and all these things that people like to identify with, like atheist or a conservative or liberal, or all these things that people like to belong to.
Sure.
There's actually a huge spectrum and a spread and a lot more nuance and shades of grey to that stuff than
exactly.
is on the simplistic surface. So.
Exactly. And I think that one of the things that shamanism's taught me on the baseline, studying shamanism's taught me on the baseline, is that was never really ever made explicit to me, and I guess you'd call my traditional education. That's the education I got from the people who weren't effectively my shamanic teachers or my shamanic guides, is that stuff has a role in society, and there's a reason for that role in society. But the reason why that stuff is there, I mean, what people would call, let's call it theism. I don't really like that term. I like the term exotericism, as you know. that is religion based on belief and faith, rather than like shamanism, which is religion based on technique and experimentation. The history of that, the unspoken thing in all of that is social elites. That is some people in society being perceived as more important than other people in society. And once they've got in that privileged position, how do they keep themselves in that privileged position? And the answer to that is theism or religion, what people would call I would call exoteric religion. So this is one of the ways where I differ. A lot of people would just call that religion, I guess. But I've become accustomed to, because of my experience with shamanism and animism, I've been accustomed to distinguishing between two types of religion. One is exotericism, that is religion based on faith and belief. These are things that I believe about the world, and I live my life on the basis of those beliefs. That's exotericism. And esotericism, where I want to understand the world and what underlies nature and the universe. And I realize that I can't do that on the basis of belief. And what I have to do essentially is find ways in which I can put myself in a position where nature starts to teach me directly, and I start to learn directly from nature. And if I do my shamanism well, I should have no expectations whatsoever as to what nature will teach me through that process. And in this way, I gain a kind of learning that's an experiential kind of learning. I guess another thing that we have to mention here is science. Science seems to be kind of the trump card of I don't know what to call them. Should we call them exoteric atheists? Those are atheists who believe that there is no God. Usually without defining what that term God means in the first place, the same way that the theists aren't. And then kind of believing that there is no God in the same way that a theist believes that there is one. Do you follow what I mean? And I think that to cut a long story short, I feel that what shamanism has taught me is that the very fact that you're having that argument kind of implies that there is a kind of, if you want to think of a way of measuring earthquakes as kind of a Richter scale, it's like an empirical scale in which you can measure whether there is or isn't a God. And of course, what you're really doing, in my opinion, is just playing with words. Yeah. And as you know, in shamanism, words are really not that important. Hence my reluctance to do the Woven Energy podcast initially. I quite enjoy it now, it has to be said. Is that thing. So as a theist, if I look back to myself as an atheist, say when I was 18 years old, this is shortly before I came into contact with, so this would be around about the year 1985. This is shortly before I came into contact with my first, if you like, shamanistic influences in my life. And at that time, I strongly believed that there was no God. Why did I strongly believe there was no God? Because I was a man of science, I was a biologist, and I knew that, evolution, the theory of evolution had, been demonstrated, 150 years ago, it had been demonstrated. And then in the intervening time period, nobody had managed to come up with any evidence that had nullified or contradicted that theory. And of course, I believed all religious people believe that God created the world and human beings as they are now, and that creation was the thing that was wrong, therefore disproving religion, if you like. That was kind of my position. And as a biologist, if you want to talk about being a theist, I was probably a theist of Charles Darwin. That was probably my. And I'm quite passionate about it, really. But of course, most religious people aren't religious for that reason. Yeah,
The problem that I see is when religion sort of almost poisons the mind, so that no matter how much evidence or how much is put in front of you, nothing will shake. For some reason, nothing will shake your faith and belief. And through that brick wall that you place up around yourself,
Yes.
nothing can permeate it.
Yeah, absolutely. But my point is, I was very much in the same position as an atheist back in 1985. No matter what evidence you'd shown me to the contrary, Charles Darwin's theory was going to stand with me. Do you follow what I mean? And, I knew that people had tried to falsify that theory. And it is true that nobody has conclusively falsified that theory. There've been amends to it, and there have been developments of the theory. I mean, for instance, a very influential guy on me, unfortunately, during my formative shamanistic year was Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz is a biologist who he has, like everybody, has good aspects and bad aspects, and he was a raving Nazi. So let's not sort of sweep that under the rug and try and pretend he wasn't. But on the other hand, he did experiments in which he involved himself. He was not an objective observer watching the experiment. He participated physically in some of the experiments that he conducted. Famously, he conditioned ducklings to follow him around. They thought he was their mother. And so Konrad Lorenz, the raving Nazi, in his lovely German garb, lederhosen, walking around the Vienna woods with these little ducklings following him. It's such a nice, charming thing till you find out he was a Nazi. But the point I'm trying to make is in that way, he was a shaman. He wasn't an objective observer looking in at those experiments. He physically participated in those experiments. And I think that when you do that, you get something that you don't get by being an observer. He could have just made a duck-shaped fluffy animal, couldn't he, on the end of a stick that moved around, and he could have conditioned the baby ducks on that, and he could have got the same results, found that it's possible to make baby ducks think that a stick with a pom-pom on the end is their mother. That's possible, just like he made them think himself was a mother. I mean, to be honest, he doesn't look, if you look at the pictures of him, he doesn't look too much different from a stick with a pom-pom on the end, in lederhosen. But the key point is that he was participating in those experiments. So I started to see, even in the scientific community, I started to see a few people. It's just like people who invent drugs and then test them on themselves rather than on other people, And I feel that in that kind of natural experimentation, that is the core difference between shamanism. We talked about core shamanism, pure shamanism. That is the core difference between pure shamanism and science. They both have something in common. They both I'm not talking about pseudosciences now. Let's stick with core science. So we're talking about chemistry, biology, physics, those sort of sciences. Yeah. They're
seeking the truth.
They're looking at nature directly, gathering data, putting experiments together to trying to isolate variables, which is another thing we don't really do in shamanism. Isolate certain variables. Well, we do to a certain extent. But the great difference is that they do not participate in the experiments themselves generally, whereas a shaman would. And I think you get something different. I'm saying there's some value in both ways of doing it. I think there are things you can gain through being an objective observer looking at the experiment, but there are also things you can gain through being a participant in the experiment. And my long-time joke I've used to describe this idea is, if I was a sports scientist, I could take a high-speed video of Tiger Woods' golf swing, and I would minutely analyze it and then look at the different dynamics, the positions of his bones, his skeletal alignment, where the power and the force, and then I could go and give Tiger Woods some tips as to how to get that ball in the hole even better than he can already. Yeah?
That's what they do.
Yes, exactly. But my point is, I would not be able to go on the golf course and demonstrate to where he can. Yeah, he has that experience. He has that experience of living it, of doing it in all be in an extremely simplistic sport compared to, for instance, spirit dance here, but extremely simplistic sport. But having said that, he has that experience, the physical, the spirit, and the mind all acting together as one unit, whereas the sports scientist is very much on the baseline, right? And Tiger Woods having that experience and that flavor, the guchach, that baseline analysis, may well be of some value to him, but only because he's so titanically steeped in that stuff. Yeah. So that's kind of the analogy I use. So that's what I want to do there is just outline what I think the difference and similarity between science and experimental science and shamanism, core shamanism or pure shamanism. That's shamanism with all the mumbo jumbo taken out, is simply that. And so in my definition of shamanism, in that specific experiment where the lederhosen-clad Nazi was walking around the Vienna woods with little ducklings following him, he was behaving as a shaman, not a scientist in that particular experiment. Whereas in other experiments that he probably did far more of, but aren't as famous because they're not as cute. I won't say, but I can only imagine as a raving Nazi what kind of experiment he was conducting during the 1930s. But, there would be science as an observer, not a participant. I think the key point is that it's providing midline and top-line experience, isn't it? Not just baseline experience, And so where I was going to with that was I held up science, a heavily baseline activity, as my rejection of theism, a heavily baseline activity, And so this is where I started to see there was sort of a third position, to theism and atheism. And that third position was not an agnostic, An agnostic's just like, I don't know, Well, I was in a position where I didn't know, but I had a method, which is a whole bunch of techniques that I could use to find out, right?
Yeah.
So, and those techniques, they put me in a position where nature's teaching me directly. We talked about even simple things like when we're practicing our breathing or practicing our amskar, using the movement of a branch of a tree to regulate the breath. That tree branch is really moving in the real world, and you could probably put some sort of movement meter on it and record the curve of the movement over time as the wind was blowing and get some information about the tree in relation to the wind. But that tells you nothing really. Well, it tells you something on the baseline, but it tells you nothing on the midline and nothing on the top line. You're not participating in it. You're not experiencing it. You're not gaining that direct experience. So, yeah.
And because we're getting that experience, it's almost like it's harder. It's like, well, you've got science and you've got notes, you've got field notes, you've got it all laid out and you've got evidence. When it's experiential, like what we might consider shamanism to be, it becomes much harder to explain the results.
On the baseline.
Which means, this is probably related back to the whole esoteric versus exoteric debate.
But you don't need to. You don't need to explain the results. This is the point. There's no expectation in shamanism that you'll be able to explain the results. But my point was, that's why people are so confused with shamanism, why there's so much, forgive me, bullshit out there with shamanism, because it's so hippy-dippy, isn't it? Well, everyone's steeped in this stuff, isn't it? The exotericism, they're steeped in it. And I feel that there are indeed atheists in the world who are also steeped in exotericism.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying that all are. But I think that that steeping, like a tea bag, you sit like a tea bag, but it's the opposite, isn't it? It's like you're the water and you're sitting with a tea bag in you and it's gradually filling you with the miasma over your entire life. And everything in your society is there conditioned to do that. And I think there are certain results of that. One is that we are encouraged to have opinions, and that's one baseline activity that seems to be quite important. And another, even worse in a way from shamanistic technique, is we're encouraged to form judgments very quickly. We're encouraged to put things in little boxes and say, oh, I understand that. The number of times that I've had this said to me in every sphere of my life by people, I remember, I was about to use a martial arts example, but now I'm going to switch to computer programming. And there was many years ago, now this would be about 1998, there was one of my teams, there was a software developer who was having a bit of trouble writing his code. And he asked me about this particular line of code. And I went over and had a look at it and explained what he should do. And he said, "Oh yes, I've got it now. I've got it now." Yeah. I thought, "Oh, that's great." So I kind of explained it in a conceptual kind of way, try and convey it so you could a general kind of way. I've got it. I understand it now. And then I'd sort of written his next line of code for him effectively. And then I went away. And then hours later, it sort of occurred to me that he hadn't written his next line of code. So this was, and what it turned out was the guy had never actually, it was a team that was completely new to me. And although the guy had the job title of programmer, it was in the printing industry. And, at that time in the printing industry, programmers were seen as the lowest of the low. So this guy had actually been transferred from guys who cut up film to make printing plates. And it was assumed that because he could use a Stanley knife, he could write code.
What? So, I suppose this was 1998.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. But the point is that the key point is, oh, I understand that. Oh, I know it. What he means is, I understand it on the baseline. Yeah. But that's no good even as a software developer, that's no good. You have to be able to live it and breathe it. It's a creative discipline. And, it's more baseline than martial arts, for instance. But you do, and this is why a lot of things, I hire a lot of people in my job. I've hired loads of people over the years. And the interview process is incredibly difficult to choose who to hire. It's really, really hard. Just say I've hired a bunch of different people. Let's stick with programmers or software developers, they're called these days. It's incredibly hard because they can come in with a bunch of certifications and certificates, and they can seem like really nice people, and they can talk a lot of stuff about what they've done, and without actually giving them a practical test. A lot of them do understand it on the baseline. A lot of these professional certifications, they sort of encourage that.
But they can't get creative with
it. They pass multiple choice exams and they get professional certifications, but they've never actually done it. And this is the issue, until you've actually done something. And that is the attitude. That's a healthy attitude, of shamanism. I guess you would talk about walking the walk. You can't understand it in theory. And that's why I worry about all these books on shamanism. You can't understand it in theory. Reading a book on shamanism will literally tell you nothing about how to be a shaman. Even if it's an instruction manual as to how to be a shaman, it'll tell you nothing. You have to go and practice. And the only person who could do that practice is you. You have to get up off your seat. You have to go out, preferably into the natural environment, and you have to start practicing shamanistic technique. And in the absence of that, it's all theory, it's all baseline ratiocination. Here's a controversial statement. It's all exoteric religion.
Yeah. Do you think, to me, atheism is it's like a huge backlash, and it's like a backlash against the absurdity of religion and how religious ideas are formed.
You can understand it, can't you? They've been telling us this ridiculous stuff for centuries. Yeah. And all of a sudden we feel free enough that we can start challenging it. Yeah.
Yeah, but also educated enough as well. And we're educated in yes, we have a big baseline logic, but the education system now, we have more reason and logic, and instead of faith and belief. I really
don't think it's that. I honestly really don't think it's that. There were some very, very well-educated people in, say, the Elizabethan era, or the era just before that, the era between Henry VIII and Elizabeth. So that would be Edward and Bloody Mary. Extremely well-educated people in the UK who probably thought all of these things about religion. They thought them. They were atheists. They thought it was all a load of nonsense because they were extremely well educated and they realized all the inconsistencies and the stuff they'd been taught to believe since childhood. And they didn't say a word because saying a word would get you killed. So I really, really don't think it's education. I really think we feel a bit safer, a little bit safer, although there are still,
well, people have more of a voice as well, which I guess does encourage people having lots and lots of opinions. But we all have this voice, you and me, we're doing this podcast. Our opinions quote unquote opinions are being thrown out into the universe.
Yeah. So
anybody can listen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you an example. Say I'm in an exoteric religion, okay? Let's make up a hypothetical one. Actually, I quite like the idea of making up religions. You know, Tarshal T, I like to make up religion. So let me make up
L. Ron Hubbard did.
let me make up a religion for it. I haven't got a name for it. Let's call it Christology or something. Yeah. Oh no, that's maybe getting a bit close to some other thing.
The algorithms will be against us there, Damon. They'll be knocking on your door.
The smiling Church of Jesus, let's call it that. Yeah. So, and here's my theory. What I believe, as many theists do, and as many atheists argue against, that the Bible. I don't believe this, but I'm acting the part of this new religion. The Bible was constructed. The Christian Bible was constructed by the guiding hand of God, and it has two parts. It has a New Testament and an Old Testament. But whenever you form a cult or a new religion, you have to have something that's a bit different from the competition in order to promote your particular brand. So let me think of something that's different. Most branches of Christianity believe that the Old Testament is a clarification or gives the basis for the New Testament and the teachings on the New Testament. Yeah. So, but in my particular branch of Christianity, I believe that, as we've discussed before, possibly Jesus was a more shamanistic type of teacher. And it wasn't him who was deeply steeped in Judaism, but his first generation of students, including St. Peter, St. Paul, those guys. Those were the guys who were deeply steeped in Judaism. And just as we've talked about, happened within 20 years of the founding of the Shinshukyo in Japan, they went from a very esoteric place to ridiculously exoteric within 20 years. Those guys felt uncomfortable with what this guy called Jesus had been teaching them because it didn't conform to their miasma. It didn't conform to the law, the Old Testament. So, but God let them put the Old Testament in there anyway, not in order to reinforce the New Testament. Remember, the New Testament was written by Peter and Paul and various other people who were not Jesus, but Jesus' disciples. Mostly written by Paul. So tradition tells us. We have no way of knowing one way or the other if any of these guys even existed, So, but the bottom line is they put the Old Testament in to make themselves feel comfortable, and they twisted what Jesus had taught by trying to rewrite the history of the life of Jesus in the Gospels and the attitude of Jesus in the letters and the other books in the New Testament. They twisted it so that it came into alignment with the Old Testament, much more into alignment with the Old Testament. And so in my new church, I'm going to have God allowed that to happen with his gently guiding hand, his nurturing hand, so that true Christians, they like to use this word true, can use the Old Testament to subtract what's in it from the New Testament, to get rid of those old unpleasant attitudes like an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, and all that kind of stuff, and subtract that from what the miasmatic disciples of Jesus said in the New Testament, and therefore allow Jesus' own words to come through. When you subtract all those bad attitudes from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, you end up with turn the other cheek, love thy neighbor, let he is without sin cast the first stone, and there's not much else, yeah? If I was going to pick a branch of Christianity... Just
general advice in a self-help book.
Yeah, absolutely. So effectively, you understand the New Testament by subtracting the Old Testament from its text. That's kind of and its attitudes, yeah? So there's my new church, right? So I've set up my new church, and I think I need some donations now. So I'm going to start up a YouTube channel or something, start proselytizing. Actually, I think if I really did that, I'd probably get a few followers, because I think there are a lot of people at the fringe the fringe liberal edge of religion, certainly in religions like the Church of England, who are actually pretty nice people, and they don't believe in fire and brimstone. They don't believe in killing people just because they, picked up sticks on the Sabbath and all that kind of stuff. They don't believe in that stuff at all. They just believe Jesus was a really nice guy. But here's the problem for those people, and maybe even when they join my church, yeah? Here's the problem. I'm born into that community, and I'm born into this, I don't know what we call it, I can't even remember the name, but there's so many of those things. It'd be impossible to pick a name that hadn't already been taken anyway. I'm born into this religious community, and I don't believe this stuff. I don't believe in the virgin birth, for instance. There's an example, that's not true. I don't believe it. Therefore, I start looking for other things that aren't true. I don't believe you should stone old men who've been trying to keep warm by the fire on a Sunday or a Saturday, depending on which one you believe the Sabbath is. I don't believe that you should do that. I don't believe that you should sacrifice people in order to appease God. I don't believe that God should sacrifice himself in order to appease God. I don't believe in any of that stuff. So I'm starting to think, gosh, I'm an atheist. I don't believe this tradition I'm brought up in. And I start to believe that that's not true. Yeah. But here's my problem. That's only inside me. That's only on my baseline. Yeah. Outside of me, if I say that stuff, my parents, my aunts and uncles, my friends in the church, all these people around me who I rely on.
Your tribe, your biologically wired safety net.
Yes. At the very least, they're going to frown upon me. And at the most, they're probably going to put a bullet in me. Or even worse, perhaps, I'm thinking about Ling Chi in China, which they got the death of 1,000 cuts, It tends to be very religious people who do that kind of thing, yeah? And so so it's not safe for me to admit that I'm an atheist, yeah? Not only that, when somebody asks me, they'll be able to tell that I'm an atheist if I stop going to church, so I keep going to church, yeah? They'll tell I'm an atheist if I'm not piously doing my prayers. So I keep piously doing my prayers. Yeah. So here's my question for the entire world. Take all the exoteric religions in the entire world. How many people in all of those religions are like that? Are towing the line? And I've seen this. When you get very, very close to people and they trust you, they're willing to open up about stuff like that. And I've a shockingly high percentage of the people who are very religious, who I've got close to, are not as religious as they appear, anywhere near as religious the appearance they give. In some ways, they find it a safety net to appear to be more religious than everybody else around them. Yeah. Do you remember we talked about the events when the Christian
missionaries
quick start praying.
Yeah.
Get in the church. Yeah. Really, every time the missionaries arrive, these guys are praying. Yeah. My feeling is that is. I go so far as to say that's the majority of these people. The absolute majority.
It's fascinating that you're talking about that now, because I have a very, I think I've experienced that myself, because I did run around the whole atheist community, my close circle of friends. And when you start, the way I see it is when you're around particularly dogmatic people or people who have very firm beliefs in something, when you start shaking that up or start thinking other things to what people consider your role to be within the group, they start clawing you down. They don't let you leave. And you feel very much like I did at the time. So this is very personal. It's like I felt like I couldn't really express myself in a way that allowed me to explore other things, should I say.
Yes.
And it was only until a crisis point that I do remember quite strongly, a crisis point where I don't know what a breakdown is, but I guess something along the lines it might be classed as that. And then you have to cut. You have to cut in a way that you can then grow and explore and be more.
Yeah. Tyrach,
yeah.
Yeah, so we're coming on to spirit dance.
That's a skill, right? I mean, that's like, it's one of the hardest skills in life, is to be able to take a good look at the people around you and cut in a positive way, but cut people out of your life that bring you down and that don't let you explore other things, or that bring detriment to your life in some shape or form.
Sure. So I also had that. I was a long time ago now, though. We're talking about like when I was 17, 18, but it was a long time ago now. But I in an interesting kind of way, like I said, I was brought up in an atheist household, and my parents were atheists. And my dad in particular, now it might sound like I'm being critical of my dad. I was blessed to have the best dad ever. The guy's flipping fantastic, and if I was as rounded and wholesome a character as him, I would be happy. But in this particular case, it was very interesting because it was a scientific argument, the discussion that we had, not an argument. I found it quite hard to convince him because he'd studied science, but he'd studied it in the years before, the expansion theory of the universe was accepted. And he didn't like the Big Bang theory. He didn't like it because it smacked too much of religion. It smacked too much of creationism, that the universe could be created from nothing. And he much preferred the theory that, in those we're talking about, we're probably talking about back into the 1970s, early 1980s. He preferred the constant state theory of the universe, where the universe is just eternal and the stars are just, and the galaxies are just milling around. And he preferred that because it was much further, as an atheist, it was much further away from religion. But then when we had Hubble's insight, Hubble looked
the Hubble constant, wasn't it?
Looked at the red or blue shift of the galaxies, and determined that the vast majority of them, 99.9% recurring of the galaxies, except a few of the galaxies that are very, very close to our galaxy, are all heading away from us. That was scientific evidence. We had hard scientific proof that was the case. But he still found it very, very difficult to believe because, in a sense, I think his belief in his atheism sort of overshadowed his belief in science, if you see what I mean, his faith in science in that particular instant. And he just didn't believe it. Basically, he didn't believe it.
So just like a religious person would have their views skewed by their faith and belief.
And this is a guy who's very open-minded, very relaxed, the calmest, probably the calmest person I've ever met in my life. You'd set a bomb off next to him and he wouldn't flinch, It's just very laid back, very caring person. But at the same time, in a way, there was a, in my opinion, there's some limitation there through the strong belief, exoteric belief in his kind of version of atheism. What I would say is that it was to the extent that he believed that the Big Bang theory was associated with creationism. And therefore, simply because he was an atheist, he couldn't accept the scientific data that was being presented. Not that I presented any, because, I was very young. I didn't present any kind of hard empirical data to him. But bless him, he's not with us anymore. But, don't think that I didn't like that. I love the guy a bit. An amazing human being. Yeah. So.
Right. So I've got one last question for you, Damon, before we wrap this episode up. I think it's been fascinating so far. Something I've been battling with over the last year or two, which I think might resonate with maybe a few listeners. Shamanism is like getting into this stuff, and we started years ago now. It's about 5 or 6 years when we first got into this stuff. I first got into this stuff, and it's like opening Pandora's box, isn't it? I mean, once it's opened, it's very difficult to shut it. You can't ignore it, and it changes your perspective on things in many ways.
Yeah. We did have a talk about this, myself and who. We did have a talk about this at the time, and we on the balance, we felt that it would be of value to you, though it's on the other hand, we know, having been through it ourselves, that we knew that it would be hard as well.
Yeah. And through that, I've started taking a good look at my life. I've met my wife, and I'm extremely happy. I've got a lot of business stuff, ventures going on. Various fingers in various pies. But there is a nagging kind of feeling that's starting to gnaw away at me. Why are you doing all this stuff, and what's going on, and it's like I like it in a way because I've got more drive, I've got more ambition, and I've got clearer head, and I'm getting direction in my life. But at the other hand, Joe, you're not meditating, you're not going out and doing your shamanism, you're not do you know what I mean? It's like,
sure. I think I've said several times on this podcast, don't beat yourself up over it. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing, because what you got to remember, that what we are talking about, me and you, in our society, is we can't do shamanism. We have to satisfy ourselves with esotericism, because shamanism requires us to live in nature all day long, every day, with a small group of people, and we're totally reliant on each other, and we don't have any safety net, and we don't have any of this stuff around us to do shamanism, we need to be in that situation. As soon as we put ourselves in a miasmatic society, which we didn't have any choice of that, we were both born into it, then all of these other complexities come up. And, you said we've set out to catalogue shamanism from the ground up in these podcasts. Well, there's another thing, isn't it? There's the elephant in the room, esotericism. That's shamanism knowingly practiced within civilized, settled societies, which has to deal with titanic amounts of the miasma that shamanism doesn't have to deal with in its natural environment. And is that stuff complicated? Is that stuff difficult? You bet it is. Maybe we should do what we sort of talked about is we would do a podcast on shamanism and go through all the 7 stages. And then once you got to the end of that, then we might start addressing some esoteric technique and what esoteric groups have added on to shamanism over the years in order to try to directly deal with that issue. I mean, things like myth making, which shamans have never had to do really, the esoteric groups have done in a big way. Those sort of techniques. We could maybe do, what I'm thinking is maybe we could do a preliminary podcast on esotericism rather than shamanism. I know we keep thinking of new things to do a podcast on, but it's an altogether more difficult thing, isn't it? Because shamanism has no advice. I know exactly how you feel because I was there as well. Shamanism itself has no advice as to how to deal with that. Esotericism has a lot to say about that, but shamanism has virtually nothing to say on that subject because it's a non-subject to people who live in shamanistic societies. They don't have all these social pressures. They don't have these people who are their parents, but you know what I mean? To anything like the extent that we do. And so that nagging feeling, 2 things, should I be practicing it? Well, you've got a life, and then another way of looking at it, that is on the question and answer episode, you asked me, somebody asked the question, where had I practiced shamanism? And then I thought what the thought that flashed through my head was, since about the age of 18, everywhere I've been. Yes. I can just give you a catalogue of all the places that I've been. Do you follow what I mean? And I guess that's what I was trying to say when it says it's a difficult question to answer because the sort of stereotypical idea of what shamanism actually is among the general public makes it a problematic question to answer. But to a shaman, in a shamanistic society, a member of his group, his tribe, is unlikely to come and ask him that question, where have you practiced shamanism? They're unlikely to ask the question. But if they did, you'd probably just look around and say, here.
Yeah.
That's a shamanistic answer right here, where I am. Yeah.
I remember you always used to say, and this since starting shamanism, and I've no idea whether this is to do with shamanism or not, but all I can say is since actually starting it, the thing that you always talked about, when you're on your deathbed and you look back on your life, what story have you told? What
picture have you painted?
What picture have you painted? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just becoming, people can say that shit to you all day long and it washes over you like, yeah, whatever. Exactly. And then there's a certain point in your life where you go, oh yeah. Actually, that makes kind of sense. Yes. Like people saying, live every day like it's the last and all this stuff. Yeah. But really, hang on.
yeah, absolutely. Do you know what? That getting to that point is the biggest step of all. You got to that point. When we encountered you, you had got to that point. Yeah. But
I was kind of desperate at the time.
So, and you
didn't know it.
Yeah, absolutely. But getting somebody who isn't at that point to that point, that's a nightmare. That's what esotericism's about, yeah? And that is a nightmare. I've tried that. It's, I guess a lot of our listeners to a great, or a lot, these things are also mastered to a degree. I bet a lot of our listeners on this podcast have got to that point in their lives. Either they've got to it recently or they've got to it years ago and those guys will know exactly what we're talking about. But that kind of turnaround point. But also remember, we said that a lot of people turn to exotericism because they feel there's something missing. Yeah. That's something missing. So there's two parts to this. One is what value have I contributed to the world? What have I contributed to the world in my life? That's a kind of baseline question, but it is a satisfying question if you can come up with a positive answer. But there's more than that. There's discovering your parent. There's becoming part of the natural world. That's what really fills that hole. And that can never be done on the baseline. That's what you get through that practice, through that putting yourself, Conrad Lorenz with a little duck style, into the center of the experiment, into the center of nature, and getting direct feedback and living it and breathing it and being part of it, and coming to a synergistic understanding of it, and you can see that in that way, shamanism is nothing other than animism on steroids, basically. Or if you want to go on cattle, animism on catalysts, many different kinds of catalysts. One of which is dance, So I think that what would be a useful answer to your question. It's a big question. It'll take me a long time to go into it in any detail. But what I'm saying is there are esoteric groups in the world who do have answers to that question. What can I do about this feeling that I have, these negative feelings that I have, which effectively a kind of way of rubbing up against the miasma. This is actually the Toyota, believe it or not, I've got a word for this. They recognize it as this problem as part of their business, and they call it moody. And what it is it's when the miasma grinds up against business process and creates a kind of friction, and they call that moody. So there are actually successful companies, using shamanistic concepts as their part of their day-to-day operating principles, which I find quite interesting. But yeah, it is a factor of esotericism, and there's a lot to say about esotericism. We could talk about groups like even Western groups. We've got the Rosicrucians, we've got Freemasons, people like that, formerly the Knights Templar, those sort of guys, and then horror of horrors, the notorious Prieuré de Sion. I could maybe give quite a seriously different perspective on those guys from what you may have heard in the media, or if you look up on YouTube or whatever.
As is quite often the case.
Again, so and then in the Far East, Genyosha and these sort of organizations, Kinuri, lots of. I'm being very careful which ones I'm naming. I'm naming historical ones that are now defunct because I don't want to say any current ones. But these sort of groups in the Far East, that we could talk about how they think, how they operate, how they view the world, and what they try to achieve, and what answer they try to give to that question. I'm lying on my deathbed, and I'm lying there very satisfied, or feeling fairly satisfied with my life. What advice do they give ahead of time in order that you can achieve that on the baseline? And indeed, how do you deal with the more negative aspects of the miasma directly that you don't have to deal with in a shamanistic community, that we do have to deal with in these civilized societies? So maybe there's yet another episode that we could do quite soon on our long list of episodes that we could do quite soon. Yeah.
Well, one thing's for sure, it's I prefer having it than not having it, because not having it's just like walking around with your eyes shut. So
sure.
So yeah, fantastic. I think it's been a great episode. We've I think coming up on the podcast, we've got a few ideas. There's one I wanted to run by you called you mentioned it in a podcast a while ago, and you said, the classic, that's for another podcast. I could do a whole podcast episode on that, Joe. Smell. Shamanic technique and smell. So I thought maybe that would be a cool one for our 30th episode, which will be next episode. But it doesn't have to be, but I just thought it'd be
I mean, we keep putting off and off the introduction as
we do,
and but there's probably a good reason for that, because the grove ain't ready yet.
Well, so it's all going to come. It's all going to come.
I'm quite happy to put that off as long as you like, really. So we'll do as many episodes as you want.
30th episode and everything. It could be the official start to stage 3. That's a good little milestone. It could be the smell, another technique, because we haven't done a solid technique for a while.
We could do 64 episodes on the 64 hexagrams. That'll stall a bit.
Don't scare people, doing. You're scaring our audience. What are you doing? So, and also shamanism and business. I don't think we've done that episode yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
We keep banging on about that one.
That'll
be funny. Just talked about it, so
that'll be funny. Yeah.
That'll be one for when we're tired.
I'm happy with any of them, mate. Happy with any of them.
Cool. Right, let's call it a day. Thank you ever so much for listening. Head to wovenenergy.com and you can grab a Get Started episode where I try and prod and poke Damon a bit to talk about some more controversial things. So grab yourself that, and thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for who knows what the next episode's going to be. But you can find out. See you then.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.